She rolled into town on a broken wheel and a lie. The lie was small, tucked away behind tired eyes and the dust of a 1,000-mile run. The broken wheel, however, was a screeching, splintering mess that announced her arrival to the whole sorry town of Rustwood. The sun had been cooking the high plains for weeks, and by the time Joanna Red's wagon limped past the first shacks, her nerves were scorched as raw as the landscape. She didn't cry. Not when the axle groaned and the wood finally gave way on the ridge road. Not when her son, Calb, just 7 years old but with the eyes of a man who'd seen too much winter, asked if they were going to have to sleep in the dirt again. And definitely not when she saw the blacksmith's hammer go still, mid-swing, the moment her wagon's pathetic clatter disturbed the afternoon quiet. The sound of that hammer stopping was worse than a gunshot. It meant she'd been noticed. It meant the clock was ticking. "Stay in the wagon, Calb," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. She swung herself down from the driver's seat, her worn leather boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. She slapped the dust from her palms, a gesture that was more about stealing herself than cleaning up, and walked straight toward the heat and noise of the forge. She didn't have money. Not the kind that bought new wheels, anyway. She had a few coins, thin and worn, saved from mending clothes and trading buttons in towns that were now just memories behind her. It was maybe enough to bribe a man into a patch job, a clumsy fix to get her a few more miles down the road before it all fell apart again. That's all she ever hoped for. A few more miles. The blacksmith turned as she approached, and her breath caught in her throat. He was a wall of a man, his shirt plastered to his chest with sweat, his arms corded with the kind of muscle that came from swinging a hammer 10 hours a day. But it was his eyes that held her. They were steady, clear, and didn't flinch. They looked right through the dust and the desperation and saw the lie she was hiding. "Wheel," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "Split clear through. Can't go on." The man didn't answer right away. He wiped his brow with the back of a greasy hand, his gaze drifting past her to the small boy sitting straight-backed and silent in the broken wagon. Calb knew the drill. Stay quiet. Look small. Don't draw attention. Finally, the blacksmith's eyes came back to her. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, like stones grinding together. "You Joanna Red?" The world stopped. The heat, the buzzing flies, the sound of her own heart, it all just ceased. He said it like a question, but it felt like a sentence. He knew the name. And in her world, anyone who knew that name was a threat. Slowly, she gave a single, stiff nod. The blacksmith didn't smile. He didn't offer sympathy. He just let out a short grunt, walked right past her as if she were a fence post, and crouched down by the busted wheel. He ran a thick finger along the splintered grain, tracing the path of the brake. He tapped the hub, a solid, knowing sound. "Ain't the first time this one's cracked," he said. It wasn't an accusation, just a fact. "No," Joanna admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I tried to patch it myself back in Willow Creek, held up longer than I had a right to expect." He stood up, brushing sawdust and road grime from his leather apron. He looked from the wheel to her, then back to the forge, as if weighing a piece of iron before putting it to the fire. "I'll fix it," he said. Joanna's shoulders sagged with a relief so profound it almost buckled her knees. But then he added the part she was dreading. "You can pay when it's done." "I don't have payment," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Her fingers tightened on the strap of her satchel. "I didn't come here to beg for charity." He turned his back to her, already moving toward the forge. "You didn't," he said over his shoulder. "You came to get a wheel fixed. Name's Eli Garner. Shouldn't take more than a few hours." There was no kindness in his tone, not a drop. It was something else, something harder to place. It was like he wasn't doing her a favor. It was like he was settling a debt she didn't even know she owed. She stood there, frozen in the oppressive heat, watching him stoke the coals. The fire roared to life, and in its flickering light, She felt like a moth drawn to a flame that was about to burn her alive. What did he know? And how much would it cost her when he decided it was time to collect? Joanna didn't move. She just watched Eli Garner work, a knot of ice forming in her stomach despite the sweltering heat. This wasn't right. Men like him in towns like this didn't offer help for free. Charity was a story people told their children. In the real world, everything had a price, and the price was usually steeper than coin. She walked back to the wagon, her mind racing. Calb looked at her, his big dark eyes full of questions he knew better than to ask. "Is he going to fix it, Mama?" he whispered. "Yes," she said, forcing a calm she didn't feel. "He is." For the next few hours, Eli worked with a quiet, brutal efficiency. He moved like a man who had declared war on broken things. The shattered wheel came off with a grunt and a heave. The forge glowed, a hungry orange mouth in the dusky workshop. Calb, forgetting his training to be invisible, crept closer, mesmerized by the process. He watched, chin in his hands, as Eli shaped new spokes from a block of seasoned oak, his draw knife peeling away ribbons of wood with surgical precision. He watched him fit them to the hub, sanding the rim until it was smooth as glass, and sealing the whole thing with a mixture of pitch and resin that smelled like the deep woods. Joanna stayed close, but never in the way. She was a ghost in his workspace. When he needed water, she was there with the bucket before he could ask. When his brow dripped with sweat, she handed him a rag. She even spent her last few coins at the general store on a tin cup of coffee, black and bitter, which she brought to him without a word. He took it without thanks, but he didn't refuse it. That was something, at least. He didn't speak again until late in the afternoon, when the sun began its slow descent toward the jagged peaks in the west. He was tightening the last of the bolts when he glanced over at her. "You from back east?" he asked, his voice still low and gravelly. She was brushing the dust from Calb's worn boots. She paused, then nodded. "Ashfield, before the cholera took the town." "That's a long way from Ashfield," Eli observed, his eyes not on her, but on his work. "Far enough," Joanna replied, and the words hung in the air between them, heavy with everything she wasn't saying. Eli's gaze shifted to Calb, who had finally surrendered to exhaustion and fallen asleep in the shade of the tool shed, his small hat tipped over his face to block out the world. "That boy yours?" "He is," she said, her voice sharp with a sudden, fierce protectiveness. Eli didn't press. He just gave a slight nod and went back to his work, his silence more unnerving than any questions he could have asked. The new wheel was finished, just as the sun began to bleed across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood orange and bruised purple. It was perfect, sturdy, balanced, and clean. It was better than any wheel she'd had on that wagon, ever. Eli hoisted it into place and secured it to the axle without any ceremony. It was just a job, done. When he straightened up, wiping his hands on the rag tucked into his belt, Joanna stepped forward. She opened her satchel, her hands fumbling inside. "I don't have much," she said, her voice tight, "but I have these. They were my mother's, 2 silver hairpins. They're old." She held them out. They weren't much, but they were all she had left of her past, of a life before the running began. Eli looked at the pins gleaming in her palm, then back at her face. He didn't even glance at them for more than a second. "Keep 'em," he said flatly. "Don't want 'em." Joanna's hand closed around the pins. Confusion warred with suspicion inside her. "I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Men don't just fix wagons for nothing." For the first time, Eli really looked at her. His gaze wasn't angry or sharp anymore. It was just tired. A deep, bone-weary exhaustion that had nothing to do with his work. "Maybe not," he said softly, "but I ain't most men." He turned and started walking back toward the forge, leaving her standing there in stunned silence. The air was cooling fast, the kind of evening that brings the crickets out early and stretches the shadows long and thin across the dirt road. She opened her mouth to thank him, to demand an explanation, to say something. But before she could, a new sound broke the quiet. Hoofbeats, 3 sets of them, coming in slow and steady. Not the hurried rhythm of weary travelers, not the easy pace of friendly visitors. This was the sound of purpose, the sound of a hunt reaching its end. Eli's head snapped up. His whole body went rigid, his hand instinctively dropping to the heavy hammer resting on the anvil. He had heard it too. He had been listening for it. Dusk was gathering at the edge of town as 3 horses emerged from the twilight. The riders sat tall in their saddles, their silhouettes dark and menacing against the fading light. And when Joanna saw the face of the man in the lead, all the air left her lungs. Her hand flew to cover her mouth, a desperate, silent gesture to keep the scream from escaping. She took a half-step back, her body instinctively moving to shield Kalb's sleeping form from view. "Brothers," she whispered, the word a curse on her lips. Eli moved, just 1 step, but it was enough. Enough to place his solid frame partly between her and the riders. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't make a threat. He just became a wall. Levi, the eldest of her brothers, his jaw set like hammered iron, swung down from his horse. His cold eyes swept over the scene, the new wheel, the silent blacksmith, and her. He gave a slow, cruel nod. "Joanna," he said, his voice dripping with false pleasantry. "Didn't think we'd find you this far west, but you always did leave a trail." He paused, his gaze landing on Eli. His eyes narrowed. "And who's this?" "He's a blacksmith," Joanna said quickly, her voice tight. "He's no concern of yours." "I'll be the judge of what's my concern," Levi shot back, his tone turning sharp. He turned to the other 2 brothers, Jed and Micah, who were dismounting behind him. "Show her what we brought." One of them, Micah, the youngest, moved to his saddlebag. He fumbled with the clasp, his eyes avoiding hers. He pulled out a long, narrow object wrapped in dark, stained cloth. Joanna flinched as if she'd been struck. She knew that shape. She had prayed she would never see it again. Eli didn't move a muscle, but the line of his jaw went rigid as stone. Levi took the bundle and unwrapped it with a deliberate slowness, drawing out the moment, savoring her terror. He pulled back the cloth. Joanna gasped. It was a rifle. But not just any rifle, it was their father's. The one he'd sworn on his deathbed would never leave the family. The one he'd used to enforce his brutal will on all of them. And judging by the dark, caked stain along the barrel and the stock, he had died holding it. "Why?" she breathed, the word getting lost in the sudden breeze that swept through the yard. Levi stepped closer, holding the rifle out to her. It wasn't an offering. It was a threat. "Because, little sister," he sneered, "you're the last of the Reds, and the debt our father left behind has finally come due." The air crackled with a tension so thick you could taste it. The dust from the road hadn't even settled, but a storm had just rolled into Rustwood, and Joanna was standing right in the middle of it. Eli stood beside her, a silent, unmovable mountain, but even he couldn't stop the past from coming for her. Levi held the rifle out, its dark wood seeming to soak up the last of the daylight. The smell of gun oil and something else, something metallic and sickening, drifted on the air. Joanna stared at it, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she felt it in her teeth. This wasn't just a weapon, it was a legacy. A curse forged in iron and blood, passed down through a family she had tried so desperately to escape. "I told you," she said, her voice shaking but defiant. "I'm done with all of that. I want no part in your wars or your vengeance." Levi's smile was a bitter, twisted thing. "That's the funny part, Joe. You don't get a choice. It ain't done with you." His eyes flickered past her to Eli, a silent warning. "And this has nothing to do with him." Eli's gaze never left Levi's face. He was a statue, patient and waiting. Behind them, in the shadows, Kalb stirred in his sleep, murmuring something soft and childish before settling again. The sound was a knife in Joanna's heart. He was the reason she ran. He was the reason she had to keep running. "You have until morning," Levi said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "We ride at dawn. To settle the score. You'll be with us." He didn't say or else. He didn't have to. The rifle in his hand said it for him. He wrapped the weapon back in its stained cloth, laid it on the ground at her feet, and turned without another word. He swung onto his horse, his brothers following suit like loyal dogs. They kicked their mounts into a canter, disappearing back into the twilight as quickly as they had come, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy, suffocating silence in their wake. Joanna didn't move. She just stared at the bundle on the ground. Eli waited, letting the quiet stretch. He didn't push, didn't pry. He just stood by her side. Finally, she whispered, the words ragged. "It wasn't supposed to find me here." But it had. And now there would be no more running. Not until whatever blood debt her father had incurred was finally paid in full. The dust hadn't even settled when she knelt down and reached for the rifle. Her fingers barely brushed the cloth before she snatched them back, as if the thing had burned her. Eli still said nothing. He didn't ask what she was going to do. He didn't offer to help. He just watched, his expression unreadable, as the weight of 3 armed men and one man's violent death settled over the forge yard. Slowly, Joanna took a deep breath, wrapped her hands in the hem of her skirt so she wouldn't have to touch the stained cloth directly, and picked up the bundle. She slid it under the bench of her wagon, hiding it from view, hiding it from Calb. That, at least, was a small mercy. He hadn't seen. "They're not just your brothers, are they?" Eli's voice was low, cutting through the thick silence after what felt like an eternity. It wasn't a question. Joanna straightened up, her back stiff as a board. She didn't answer him directly. She looked out at the road where they had disappeared. "They were gone when our mother died," she said, her voice hollow. "Didn't even come to the funeral, didn't send a word. And now," she swallowed hard, "now they show up and deliver our father's blood-stained gun like it's a gift." Eli didn't press for more. He just nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible movement, as if he understood the unspoken language of people trying not to shatter into a million pieces. Just then, Calb stirred again. This time he sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He looked from his mother's pale, tense face to the big, quiet blacksmith standing beside her. "Mama," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep, "are we staying here tonight?" Joanna's gaze flickered from the dark road to her newly fixed wagon, then back to Eli's steady form. The thought of getting back on that road, of driving into the darkness with her brothers somewhere out there, was unbearable. But the thought of imposing on this stranger, this man who knew her name and seemed to be waiting for a story she wasn't ready to tell, was just as bad. "We shouldn't impose," she said, her pride warring with her exhaustion. "You're not," Eli said simply. He was already turning away, heading for a small, dark cabin attached to the side of the smithy. "Wagon won't get you far in the dark anyway. Got a spare cot in the back room. The boy can take the bed." Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. Fatigue won. "Thank you," she said, the words barely audible. Eli gave no answer. He just opened the side door to the cabin, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside, leaving the door open for her. An invitation, a sanctuary, or maybe just another cage. She didn't know which, but right now, she was too tired to care. She took Calb's hand and followed him into the shadows. The cot creaked under Joanna's weight, a sound that seemed to echo the fracturing of her carefully constructed peace. The small room smelled of iron, pine smoke, and something else, the faint, clean scent of shaved wood. Calb was curled up on the narrow bed against the far wall, his head on her arm, his breathing finally even and soft. He was asleep, safe for now in his ignorance. But Joanna couldn't sleep. She stared at the rough-hewn timbers of the ceiling until her eyes burned, her mind a churning vortex of memories she'd spent years trying to seal away. Her brothers. They'd been cruel boys long before they became broken men. Their father had seen to that, sharpening their edges with his harsh words and harsher fists. Their return now, with that rifle, could only mean one thing. Their father hadn't died peacefully in his bed, and they hadn't come all this way just to mourn him. They came to finish something, and they intended to drag her into it. She rose before the sun, the habit of a life on the run ingrained in her bones. She slipped out of the cabin into the cool pre-dawn air. Eli was already outside, splitting firewood with clean, powerful swings of his axe. The rhythmic thump crack was the only sound in the sleeping town. He didn't look up as she approached. "I'm leaving after breakfast," she announced, her voice flat. He paused mid-swing, the axe head buried in a log. He looked at her, his eyes clear and direct in the gray light. "With the boy?" "Yes." "Where you headed?" She looked down at her hands, twisting the fabric of her skirt. "Wherever they're not." "You think they won't follow you?" he asked, his voice devoid of judgment. She didn't have an answer for that. She knew they would. They would hunt her to the ends of the earth if they had to. Levi never let go of a grudge. Eli set the axe down slowly, deliberately, and turned to face her fully. "You running from them?" he said, his gaze pinning her in place. "Or from what they want you to be?" Joanna flinched as if he'd slapped her. He saw too much. He saw right through the walls she'd built. "They want me to take a side," she whispered, her voice breaking on the last word. "And I can't. I won't." She took a ragged breath. "They want vengeance for a man I stopped mourning years ago. They want blood for blood, and I won't teach my son that hate is the only thing a family passes down." Eli studied her for a long, silent moment. She expected him to argue, to tell her she was a fool, to tell her to face her past, but he just nodded, a slow, solemn gesture of understanding. "All right," was all he said. Not stay, not go, not you're wrong or you're right, just, all right. And somehow that simple acceptance gave her more strength than any argument could have. They ate breakfast in silence. A tense, heavy quiet filled the small cabin. Eli shared his bread, beans, and the last of a stew. Kalb, sensing the unspoken storm in the air, ate with his head down, not saying a word. Afterward, Joanna packed their meager belongings back into the wagon with a brisk, desperate efficiency. Every move was sharp, precise. She was just hitching up the mule when a shadow fell over her. She didn't have to look up to know who it was. "Leaving so soon, little sister?" Levi. He was alone this time, sitting on his horse at the edge of the yard, watching her with an expression of cold amusement. Joanna turned slowly, her body rigid. "I said what I meant, Levi. I want no part of this." "You always were the righteous one," he sneered, swinging down from his horse. He walked toward her, his boots kicking up little puffs of dust. "So high and mighty. You forget what he did to us? What he did to you?" "I remember everything," she said, her voice like ice, "and I still won't kill for him." Levi's face darkened. He took another step, closing the distance between them until he was looming over her. "This isn't just about him anymore. It's about what comes after. It's about the name. You walk away now. You let the men who did this think the Reds are weak, that we're afraid." "I am afraid," she snapped, the words tearing out of her. "I'm afraid because I have a son to raise, and I have no interest in raising him in the ruins of your pointless revenge." Just then, the cabin door creaked open. Eli stepped out onto the porch. He didn't say anything, didn't move aggressively, but his presence was a tangible thing, a silent declaration. Levi's eyes flicked to him, a flicker of contempt crossing his face. "You really think this blacksmith is going to protect you?" he scoffed. "He doesn't even know the half of it. He doesn't know what you really are." "She's told me enough," Eli said, his voice calm and steady as a river. Levi let out a low, bitter laugh. "You think you're the first man to try and save her? She's a magnet for broken things." "I don't care if I'm the first or the last," Eli replied, his gaze unwavering. "I only care that she gets to make her own choice." That stopped Levi. For just a second, the mask of cruel confidence slipped, and something else looked out of his eyes. Something older, more wounded. Maybe it was grief. He looked from Eli back to Joanna, his expression unreadable. "You really think walking away is going to keep that boy safe?" he asked, his voice softer now. "I know that raising him to be a killer won't," she shot back. Levi held her gaze for a long moment. It seemed like he wanted to say more, to argue, to plead, but in the end he just shook his head. He turned without another word, mounted his horse, and rode away, not fast, but with a grim, steady pace that promised this wasn't over. An hour later, her wagon was rolling out of Rustwood, heading south. Joanna kept her eyes fixed on the road ahead, refusing to look back. Eli didn't wave. He just stood at the edge of his forge, arms crossed over his massive chest, watching her go until the wagon was just a speck in the distance. The road south was quiet. Too quiet. For a day and a half, there was nothing but the sun, the dust, and the steady, reassuring rattle of the wheel Eli had repaired. Calb slept curled up in the back, and for a few blissful hours, Joanna allowed herself to believe it was possible. Maybe she really had outrun them. Maybe this time, she was free. The illusion shattered on the second night. The first warning was a thin plume of smoke rising from the trees up ahead, a ghostly gray finger pointing to the sky. The second was the smell that drifted on the evening air, scorched wood, burnt canvas, and something else, something acrid and horribly sweet that made her stomach clench. She pulled the wagon to a halt. "Stay here, Calb," she ordered, her voice sharp. He sat up, his eyes wide with fear. She slipped into the trees, her hand resting on the small knife she kept tucked in her belt. The smell grew stronger with every step. 10 paces in, she saw it. A burned-out wagon, its axles glowing faintly in the twilight. 2 bodies, sprawled in the dirt nearby. Not her brothers. A family. A man and a woman who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. And pinned to the blackened trunk of a pine tree with a hunting knife was a piece of scorched paper. A note. 4 words, scrawled in ash. "This is your fault," a message. They weren't following her. They were clearing a path. They were sending a message to her, and to anyone who might help her. She stumbled back to her wagon, her skin crawling, her breath coming in ragged gasps. They would never stop. They would burn the whole world down around her just to get what they wanted. She grabbed the mule's reins and turned the wagon around, her movements frantic. "Mama, what's wrong?" Calb cried, clinging to her arm. "What's happening?" She couldn't lie to him, not anymore. The time for lies was over. "We're going back," she said, her voice a raw whisper. "Back to the man with the hammer?" he asked, his small voice trembling. "Yes. Is it because of the bad men?" She could only nod, the word caught in her throat. He leaned against her, his small body tense. "Okay," he said, with a child's simple, heartbreaking acceptance. It took them a day and a half to get back to Rustwood. When they clattered back into the dusty town, Eli was there, standing outside his smithy, hammer in hand, as if he'd never moved, as if he'd been waiting for them. She didn't have to say a word. The terror in her eyes, the soot on her dress, the way Calb clung to her, it told him everything. He just looked at her, then at the boy, and then gave a single, grim nod. "Inside," he said. That night, after Calb was asleep, Joanna stood at the open door of the forge, staring out into the oppressive darkness. Eli was behind her, the rhythmic click-clack of him loading shells into a rifle she hadn't seen before filling the silence. It was a heavy-gauge hunting rifle, well-oiled and deadly serious. Then he stopped. He walked over to the hearth where she had hidden her father's gun. He picked it up, the stained cloth falling away. He held it out to her. "Levi left this," he said. It wasn't a question. "You want it?" She looked at the rifle, at the dark history it held in its wood and steel. Then she looked away, a shudder running through her. "No," she whispered. "I don't ever want to touch that thing again." "I'll use it then," he said simply. She turned to face him, her eyes wide with disbelief. You'd really do that? You'd stand between me and my own family? Eli looked at her, his expression unyielding. I'm not standing between you and them, he said, his voice low and certain. I'm standing with you. There's a big difference. Joanna closed her eyes, the weight of his words settling over her. For the first time in a very long time, she wasn't entirely alone. She took a deep, shaky breath. Then I guess, she whispered, opening her eyes to meet his gaze, I have to stop running. You were never running, Eli replied, his voice soft. You were protecting what matters. The moment hung between them, fragile and unspoken, charged with a strange new energy. It was a promise, a pact. And then it was shattered. Knock, knock, knock. A sharp, hard rap on the main forge door. It wasn't the sound of fists. It was the butt of a rifle, deliberate, cold, a threat wrapped in a demand. Eli didn't flinch, and neither did Joanna. The time for cowering was over. They turned as one and stepped toward the sound, ready for whatever hell was waiting on the other side. The knock came again, 3 sharp, impatient strikes that echoed off the stone walls of the forge. It was a sound that didn't ask for entry. It demanded it. Eli set the red family rifle down carefully by the hearth, not taking his eyes off the door. He gave Joanna a single, steady look that communicated more than words ever could. Once this door opens, there's no going back. She nodded once. She knew. The past wasn't just knocking, it was breaking down the door. In the back room, Calb sat bolt upright on the cot. His eyes were wide in the dim light, but he was silent. He clutched the small, crudely carved wooden horse Eli had made for him the other night, his knuckles white. He'd seen and heard too much in his short life to waste energy on questions that had no soft answers. He just watched and waited. Eli's boots made soft, thudding sounds on the packed earth floor as he crossed the room. He didn't hesitate. He reached for the heavy iron latch, lifted it, and pulled the door inward. A man stood on the threshold, silhouetted against the deepening twilight. But it wasn't Levi, it wasn't Jed or Micah. This man was different. He was lean and wiry, with sharp, fox-like features. He wore a dusty bowler hat that seemed out of place with the worn 6-gun strapped low on his hip. He held no weapon in his hands, just a neatly folded piece of paper. His smile was a thin, bloodless line that didn't come close to reaching his cold, calculating eyes. "You Eli Garner?" he asked, though his tone made it clear he already knew the answer. "I am," Eli said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't move from the doorway, blocking the man's view of the interior. The stranger tipped his head, a gesture of mock politeness. "Name's Knox Blythe. I'm an associate of the Red Brothers." He held out the folded note. "This is for the lady of the house." Eli didn't move to take it. "She's not to be bothered right now." Knox's smile twitched, a brief flicker of annoyance. "Well now, that's a real shame. Because her brothers, they're going to want an answer by sundown tomorrow." "They always do," Eli replied, his voice flat. A long, tense pause stretched between them. It was a silent challenge, a test of wills played out in the space of a heartbeat. Knox didn't blink. Neither did Eli. From the shadows behind Eli, Joanna stepped forward. She placed a hand on Calb's shoulder, a silent reassurance, before moving into the light. "I'll take it," she said, her voice steady. Eli didn't look at her, but he stepped back just enough to let her pass. She reached out and took the note from Knox's outstretched hand. Her fingers brushed his, and his skin felt cold, like a snake's. She unfolded the paper. It wasn't a long message, just 3 words, written in Levi's familiar, aggressive scrawl. "It's time, Joe." That was it. No threat, no location, no explanation. But she knew exactly what it meant. The final reckoning. The conversation they had all been avoiding for 13 long years. The one that started with a boy named Thorne and ended in blood. Knox tipped his bowler hat. "Pleasure doing business with you." He started to turn away, but then he paused, glancing back over his shoulder. His eyes flickered to the rifle resting by the hearth. "Pretty piece of iron you got in there," he said casually. That was their father's, wasn't it? He didn't wait for a reply. He just chuckled to himself, a dry, rattling sound, and walked back to the horse that was waiting for him in the darkness. The sound of its hooves faded into the night, leaving only the chirping of crickets and the heavy weight of his message. Joanna stared down at the note, the 3 simple words burning into her mind. It's time. They won't stop, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Even if I say no, even if I run again. They want it ended, one way or another. Eli leaned against the doorframe, his massive form a comforting presence in the gloom. Then you give it an ending, he said simply. But what if it's the wrong one? She asked, her voice filled with despair. He looked at her then, his gaze steady and unwavering. Then at least it's yours. She folded the note and tucked it deep into her pocket, as if hiding it could somehow delay the inevitable. There's something you need to see, she said. He followed her out to the wagon. She reached under the driver's bench and pulled out a different bundle. Not the rifle. This one was smaller, wrapped in oilskin and tied with a leather cord. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked at the knots. She peeled back the oilskin. Inside was a thick stack of letters, dozens of them, the paper yellowed and worn, the edges soft and frayed from countless readings. Eli raised an eyebrow. From your brothers. She shook her head, a sad, bitter smile touching her lips. From him. Your father. No, she said, her voice cracking. The man who should have been. She looked up at Eli, the story she had held secret for so long finally spilling out. His name was Thorn. He was a hired hand on our family's property. He taught me how to read. He taught me how to shoot straight, how to set a fence post, how to fix a wagon axle with nothing but a piece of twine and a prayer. She paused, taking a shaky breath. My father hated him. My brothers hated him more. They said he was making me soft, said he was filling my head with ideas above my station. Her voice dropped to a whisper. One night, they took him out to the woods behind the homestead. They beat him until they thought he was dead. Eli said nothing. He just listened, his face a grim mask. He survived, she continued. He left that night. I never saw him again. But he wrote to me, every month for years. He wrote until the year Caleb was born. Then the letters stopped. You think they did something to him? Eli asked, his voice low. I know they did, she said, her voice turning to steel. And I think the only reason they're here now, waving our father's rifle around like some holy relic, is because they want to bury what they did to both of those men. They want to bury the truth for good. Eli crouched down beside the wagon, his eyes on the bundle of letters in her hands. And what do you want, Joanna? She looked down at the faded ink, the words of a good man who had tried to save her. Then she looked up, past the dark shape of the forge, toward the hills that cradled the sleeping town. I want my son, she said, her voice clear and strong, to grow up in a world that isn't haunted by the ghosts of silent men. Eli nodded once. A decision had been made. All right then, he said, standing up. Let's go drag those ghosts out into the daylight. By noon the next day the plan was laid. It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only move she had left. She would meet them. She would go to the place they named, the southern ridge, a desolate spine of rock that overlooked the town. But she wouldn't bring a gun. She wouldn't bring fear or threats. She would bring the one thing they had spent their lives trying to destroy, the truth. She would bring Thorn's letters. Eli would go with her. He would stay hidden in the rocks, a silent guardian angel with a rifle. But they both knew that if it came to gunfire, the battle was already lost. They didn't tell Caleb what was happening. He sat on the porch of the cabin, humming to himself and swinging his legs, a picture of innocence in a world that was anything but. Joanna knelt before him, kissing the top of his head. Be good for Eli's friend from the store, she whispered, referring to the shopkeeper's wife who'd agreed to watch him. We won't be long. He nodded, but his wide, serious eyes followed her as she and Eli walked down the trail, all the way until the trees and the shadows swallowed them whole. The ridge was just as she remembered it, rocky, wind-scoured, and lonely. It felt like a place where things ended. When they reached the designated clearing, her 3 brothers were already there, waiting. Levi, Jed, and Micah. They stood by their horses, their rifles slung loose, their faces grim and unreadable. "You came," Levi said. He sounded more surprised than he let on. "I'm tired of running," Joanna answered, her voice carrying on the wind. She held the leather-wrapped bundle of letters in her hands. It was the only weapon she had. Levi's eyes narrowed, fixing on the package. "What's that? More of your trinkets?" "It's your answer," she said, her voice gaining strength. She took a step forward. "These are his words, Levi, the ones you thought you got rid of. The letters he sent me for years, the letters you intercepted and burned, the truths you tried to bury." Jed shifted his weight, his gaze dropping to the ground. Micah looked away, chewing on his lip. Only Levi held her gaze, his face a mask of cold fury. "You think bringing up that old business changes anything now?" he snarled. "It changes everything! Why did you hate him so much?" she cried, the question that had haunted her for years finally breaking free. "Because he was kind? Because he taught me that a person's worth isn't measured by the fear they can inspire?" "You don't understand!" Levi's voice rose to a shout. "He was turning you against us, against your own blood." "He was teaching me to be better than you," she shot back. "I remember who I was when you tied him to that tree and left him for dead. I remember you laughing about it at the dinner table that night." Levi's face contorted with rage. He took a step toward her, his hand dropping to the butt of his pistol. And that's when Eli stepped out from behind the rocks. The rifle was slung over his shoulder, not aimed, but its presence was a clear statement. He was calm, solid, and utterly immovable. "Is that true?" Eli asked, his deep voice cutting through the tension. "Or is this really about you being afraid? About making sure no one ever found out what kind of cowards you really were that night?" Jed's hand flew to his gun. Eli's own rifle came up in a slow, deliberate motion. "Not aiming," he said coolly. "Just reminding you how this ends." "We are not here for more blood," Joanna said sharply, stepping between them. She looked at her brothers, her heart aching with a grief that was a decade old. "But I will not be silent for you anymore. I will not raise Calb on your lies. He will know what happened here. He will know who his family is, the good and the bad." Levi stared at her, his chest heaving, his face a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. For a long, stretched-out moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the wind whistling through the rocks. Then, without a word, Levi turned, strode to his horse, and pulled something from his saddlebag. It was a small tin box, dented and rusted at the edges. "You want ghosts, Joanna?" he yelled, his voice raw with a pain she hadn't heard in years. "Here they are." He threw the box. It landed on the rocky ground between them, bursting open on impact. A handful of scorched, brittle papers spilled out. Letters. Joanna crouched down slowly, her hand trembling as she reached for one. The edges were singed black, and the ink was faded and blurred by heat, but she could still make out the first line. "Joe, if you're reading this, it means they didn't win." She looked up at her brothers, at the unexpected tears glistening in Micah's eyes, at the shame on Jed's face, at the raw, agonizing conflict in Levi's. They hadn't burned them all. They had kept some. A secret penance, a hidden guilt. "You can keep pretending you're right," she said, her voice soft now, all the anger draining out of her, replaced by a vast, empty sorrow. "But I won't. Not for one more day." She stood up, turned her back on them and their ghosts, and walked toward Eli. The sun dipped below the ridge, plunging the clearing into shadow. No shots were fired, no more words were spoken. But in the silence, something had irrevocably broken. And as she and Eli walked back down the trail toward the town, toward her son, Joanna felt something she hadn't felt in a very, very long time. Not peace, not yet, but a choice. And for the first time, it felt like her own. The tin box sat on the forge table all night, a silent testament to the day's bitter truths. Joanna didn't open it again. She didn't have to. Seeing those scorched fragments, knowing her brothers had carried their guilt with them all these years, was enough. Thorne's words, burnt, broken, but surviving, were a witness. And sometimes, bearing witness is the only justice you get. But Eli knew better. He saw it in the way she moved the next morning. Her hands were too sharp, her movements too precise. She swept a floor that was already clean, scrubbed pots that didn't need scrubbing, and restacked firewood he'd already neatly piled. She was a whirlwind of frantic, pointless activity. Calb watched her, his usual childish chatter silenced. He could feel the cracks forming in his mother's composure and was trying to guess what would come spilling out. The day was clear and bright, the sky a deceptive, peaceful blue. But Joanna was coiled tight, a spring wound to the breaking point. "A storm's not coming," Eli said, leaning in the doorway of the cabin, watching her. "But you're acting like it is." She didn't look up from her sweeping. "Something's coming." He waited a beat. "You're thinking about leaving again." She finally stopped, leaning on the broom handle. She stared at the rough wooden wall as if it held the answers. "It's crossed my mind." "You think it'll fix things?" "I think," she said, her voice tight. "It'll keep Calb from being dragged down by the same ghosts that have been chasing me my whole life." Eli crossed his powerful arms. "You're not dragging them, Joanna. They came looking for you." "That's worse!" she snapped. "You told me you were tired of running." "I am," she said, her voice cracking. "But there's a difference between standing your ground and standing in front of a firing squad." Eli was silent for a long moment. Then, with that unshakable steadiness that was his bedrock, he said, "Maybe. But there's also a difference between running away and building a life somewhere they can't tear it down." He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "Don't build on ashes, Joanna. Build where the fire never reached." His words hung in the air, a quiet challenge. For the first time all day, the frantic energy in her seemed to still. The quiet was broken at sundown. A knock came at the cabin door. Not the hard, demanding rap of Knox Blythe, not the angry fist of her brother Levi. This was a hesitant sound. 2 soft taps, then silence. Joanna opened the door. Micah stood on the threshold, alone. He looked younger than he had on the ridge, stripped of his bravado. The swagger was gone, replaced by an uncertainty that made him look like a lost boy. I came to talk," he stammered, his eyes darting from her to Eli, who had moved to stand behind her. Micah swallowed hard. "Alone? If that's all right." Joanna hesitated, then gave a slight nod. She stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind her. The air was cool and smelled of pine. They walked wordlessly to her wagon, the same wagon that had carried her into this mess. The same wagon Thorne had once helped her mend in another lifetime. Micah wouldn't look at her. He stared at the ground as he spoke. "I didn't know Levi kept those letters. I swear, Joe, I thought they were all gone." "You were there when they tied him up," she said, her voice flat. "I was 16, he shot back, a flicker of his old defensiveness showing. "I was scared of Pa, same as you. You were old enough to help him." "I didn't help them either," he insisted. "I didn't lay a hand on Thorne, I just stood there." His voice broke. "I know that's not better, but it's the truth." A heavy silence fell between them. The wind kicked up dust around their feet. Finally, Micah reached into his coat and pulled out a folded, yellowed square of paper. He held it out to her. Joanna took it, her fingers stiff. She unfolded it slowly. It wasn't a letter. It was a birth record. Calb's. Her throat went dry. Her name was there, but the space for the father's name was blank. You lied to him, Micah said, his voice quiet. Not an accusation, just a statement of fact. We all thought Calb was Thorne's son. That's why Levi was so angry, why he could never let it go. She folded the paper, her knuckles white. He's not Thorne's, she said, her voice a dead monotone. Micah finally looked at her, his eyes full of a pained confusion. Then why lie about it? Why let us believe that all these years? Because it was easier. Because the truth was 1,000 times worse. Because the real truth would have gotten her killed. You don't owe me an answer, Micah said softly. But you owe Calb the truth someday. He took a deep breath. Levi's planning to ride out, back to the old homestead. He wants to bury Pa, properly. He thinks if he can just put him in the ground, say some words, it'll all be over. Will it? She asked. Micah shrugged, a gesture of helpless despair. I don't know, but he's going to do it, with or without you. He paused, then looked her straight in the eye. That's not why I came, Joe. Then why? To say I'm sorry, he whispered, the words raw and clumsy. For everything. It hit her with the force of a physical blow. An apology. After all these years, it wasn't a solution, it wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. She watched him mount his horse and ride away, a lonely figure disappearing into the dying light. Later that night, by the soft glow of a single lamp, she told Calb. Not the whole truth, not the dark, violent parts, but enough. She told him that he had family who had done terrible things, but that their sins were not his to carry, that he had a right to grow up and be his own man, free from the shadows of his name. Calb listened, his small face serious. When she was finished, he just leaned his head against her shoulder and whispered, I don't care where I came from, Mama. I only care where we're going. The next morning, Joanna and Eli packed the wagon again. But this time, they weren't running. They were riding toward the ghosts. They rode north, back to the red homestead, back to the place where it all began. They arrived just before sunset. The old house was a skeleton, its windows boarded up, its porch scorched from a fire long ago. Behind it, in the overgrown family plot, her brothers were already there. A fresh grave was half dug, the shovel resting in Levi's hands. He didn't look up as they approached. You came, he said, his voice flat. Only because I want this to be over, Joanna said, climbing down from the wagon. It is over, Levi grunted, gesturing to the plain pine box on the ground. He's dead. That's not the part that was left unfinished, she replied. Jed, their other brother, broke the tense silence. We found a letter, in his coat pocket. From him. Joanna's breath caught. What did it say? Just one line, Jed mumbled, unable to meet her eyes. It said, Forgive them. They were only boys. The wind rustled the tall, dead grass. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The weight of their father's final words, a plea for a mercy he had never shown anyone, settled over them. Then Joanna walked to the edge of the open grave. She looked down at the simple casket. She took the bundle of Thorne's letters, the ones that had been her secret comfort for so long, and let them fall. They fluttered down, landing softly on the lid of their father's coffin. She wasn't burying them for him. She was burying them for herself, letting go of the girl who had needed them to survive. Something in Levi's face seemed to break. He watched the letters fall, and a single hard tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. Micah stepped forward. You're not staying, are you? Joanna shook her head. But we're not running either. Where will you go? She looked at Eli, then at Calb, who was watching from the wagon, his face solemn. Somewhere we're not haunted. Levi picked up the shovel and pushed the last of the dirt into the grave. There were no prayers, no ceremony, just the heavy final sound of earth covering the past. He looked up at her, his eyes red-rimmed. Be safe, Joe, he said. It was the first time in his life he had ever said it to her. Joanna climbed back into the wagon. Calb reached for her hand. Eli took the reins. They rode west, toward the setting sun, leaving the red homestead and its ghosts behind them. As night fell, they made camp on a new ridge, under a canopy of unfamiliar stars. Calb curled up by the fire, the little wooden horse clutched in his hand. Joanna leaned her head against Eli's strong shoulder. For the first time in years, she wasn't bracing for the next storm. She wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. She was just breathing. Because this time, she wasn't just surviving. She was beginning. They didn't look for a town right away. They drifted west, letting the rhythm of the road wash away the lingering stains of the past. For weeks, their home was the Wagon, their roof the vast, star-dusted sky. They camped by creeks with names like Tabor's and Stonefall, places where the water ran clear and the wind didn't sound like it was whispering someone else's sorrows. It was a quiet time, a healing time. The deep lines of tension around Joanna's eyes began to soften. She started waking up from dreams that weren't nightmares. Calb, freed from the constant unspoken threat, became a different boy. He started collecting stones, smooth, gray river stones, and would spend hours arranging them in intricate patterns beside their nightly campfires. He gave them names, invented stories for them. He was building a world of his own, one stone at a time. One morning, Eli rode back from a scouting trip with news. He'd found a settlement a few valleys over, a trading post called Tabor's Creek, that was trying to rebuild after a wildfire had swept through the previous spring. Their blacksmith shop burned down, he said, unsaddling his mule. The owner is offering good coin for a man who can work a forge. Joanna looked up from the stew she was stirring. Are you thinking of taking it? I'm thinking we could use the coin, he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. And I'm thinking my hands are starting to forget what it feels like to hold a hammer. She smiled back, a genuine, easy smile that still felt new to her face. You could teach Calb, she suggested. To smith? Eli's eyebrows shot up. To build, she corrected gently. He's already building something with those stones of his. Might as well teach him to make things that the rain can't wash away. So they packed the wagon one last time, not to flee, but to put down roots. Tabor's Creek wasn't much, just a handful of half-built structures clustered around a general store, but there was a stubborn energy to the place. The people moved with the determined rhythm of survivors who had decided to fight back. The blacksmith's workshop stood at the edge of the settlement, its roof partially collapsed, its walls blackened with soot. The forge inside was a choked, rusty mess, but Eli just grinned. I can get her breathing again, he said, with the confidence of a man who understood the language of fire and iron. The owner of the post was a lean, tough-as-nails woman named Marn Bishop. She looked Eli up and down, her eyes sharp and assessing. You're the smith? She asked. I am, Eli replied. Thought you'd be older. Thought you'd be taller, he shot back without missing a beat. Marn let out a short, barking laugh. You'll do. 50 cents a horse, 30 for wagon wheels. I'll even pay up front for the forge repairs if you can start this week. Eli glanced at Joanna. She nodded. He stuck out his hand. Deal. The cabin next to the workshop was small, just 4 walls and a roof patched with tin, but it had a stone hearth and a small loft. It was more than enough. Calb immediately claimed the loft as his kingdom, hauling up his precious collection of stones and an armful of wildflowers. That night, Joanna stood at the window, watching the soft glow from the ruined forge. Eli was already in there, clearing debris, his powerful silhouette moving with a familiar, comforting purpose. He belonged in a place like that, a place where broken things were made whole again. She was just about to turn away from the window when a knock came at the door. Her body went rigid. The old fear, the familiar dread, coiled in her stomach. But this knock was different. It wasn't hard or demanding. It was hesitant, almost gentle. Eli heard it too. She saw him freeze in the firelight, then wipe his hands on a rag and step out into the darkness of the yard. Joanna opened the cabin door, and her world tilted on its axis. Standing on her doorstep was a ghost. Older, thinner, his hair shot through with gray, but it was him. The man from her letters. The man her brothers had left for dead all those years ago. Thorn. He stood there, holding his hat in his hands, his jaw working as if he was trying to form words that had been lost for over a decade. When he finally spoke, his voice was a rough, broken whisper. "Joe." She couldn't speak. She couldn't breathe. All the air had been sucked out of the world. He nodded once, as if he had expected her silence. "I didn't know if you'd want to see me," he rasped. "But I heard about what happened to your father. I had to know. I had to know if you were still alive." Still alive? The words scraped something raw inside her. "You're supposed to be dead," she managed to say, the words feeling foreign and clumsy in her mouth. He looked down at his worn boots. "I was," he said softly. "For a while."
Eli had crossed the yard now, the rifle held loosely in one hand, its presence a low thrum of warning. "You want something here?" he asked Thorn, his voice not harsh, but thick with a quiet, dangerous protectiveness. "Just a word," Thorn said, his eyes pleading with Joanna. "Then I'll be on my way." Joanna stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind her. The three of them stood in the yard as a soft rain began to fall, slicking the dust and cooling the air. "I wrote to you," Thorn said, his voice gaining a bit of strength. "For years. I never stopped." "I know," she whispered. "Then the letters, they started coming back, unopened. I thought you were burning them." "They were," she said, "but not by me. I should have come back anyway," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I was a coward." "Yes," she said simply. "You should have." His gaze drifted past her, to the small, glowing window of the cabin's loft. "The boy," he said, his voice dropping. Is he mine?" This was it. The question she had dreaded for 7 years. The lie she had told her brothers, the lie that had almost gotten her killed, was now staring her in the face. She could tell him the truth. She could shatter this ghost's heart. Or she could give him a gift. A small piece of a life he never got to have. She met his gaze, and in that moment, she made a choice. "He's ours," she said. A wave of emotion washed over Thorn's face. Grief, joy, a decade of pain and longing. He nodded, the tears he'd held back for so long finally tracking down his weathered cheeks. "I'm not here to stay, Joe," he said, composing himself. "I'm just passing through, heading south. There's trouble brewing down there, and men like me, well, we're needed." "You could stay," she heard herself say, the words surprising her as much as him. He gave her a sad, gentle smile. "I wouldn't fit. You've built something new here. A ghost would only haunt it." He paused, his gaze full of a fierce, fatherly pride. "But I had to see you. I had to see him. I had to know that the fight was worth it." He stepped forward, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought he was going to embrace her, but he just reached out and gently touched her arm. "Thank you, Joe," he whispered, "for teaching me what courage looked like, before I forgot how to find it myself." He put his hat back on his head, gave Eli a solemn nod of respect, and walked away into the rain, his form dissolving into the misty darkness. They didn't follow him. They just listened to the sound of his hoofbeats fading away, until there was nothing left but the soft drumming of the rain on the roof. Joanna didn't cry. She just stood there, letting the rain wash over her, feeling the last of her old ghosts finally being laid to rest. Inside, Calb was asleep, his stones lined up neatly on the windowsill, glistening with raindrops. Eli lit a lamp, its warm glow pushing back the shadows. He looked at her, his eyes full of a deep, quiet understanding. "He didn't ask to stay," she said. "I know. And I didn't ask him to." "I know that too," Eli said. He stepped closer and wrapped his strong arms around her. She leaned into him, not because she was weak, but because even the strongest anchors need a harbor to rest in. The forge came back to life. The town of Tabor's Creek, it turned out, was full of broken things. Eli fixed them all. Joanna found herself working beside him, her hands remembering the feel of a wrench, the heft of a hammer. Calb, now with a small custom-made hammer of his own, became their apprentice. They were a family, forged in fire and loss, building something new. For a few peaceful weeks, it felt like they had finally found their sanctuary. And then a stranger rode into town. He was dressed in expensive clothes, moved with the predatory grace of a wolf, and had eyes as cold and black as a winter night. The locals called him Braddock. They said he was buying up land all over the territory, that he was going to bring the railroad through. Joanna didn't trust him from the moment he smiled at her, a flash of white teeth in a handsome face, and said he liked the fire in her eyes. He started asking questions. Questions about Eli. Questions about where she'd come from. Questions about the boy. Too many questions. One night, after the forge had gone quiet and the moon was hanging low over the creek, they found a note nailed to the workshop door. No name, no threat, just 6 chilling words. Does the boy know the truth? Joanna crumpled the note in her fist, her blood turning to ice. The ghosts weren't gone. They had just been waiting. And a new, more dangerous storm was about to break over Tabor's Creek. The note stayed clenched in Joanna's fist, the paper growing soft and worn from the heat of her palm. She didn't show it to Eli, not at first. She held the ugly question in the dark, turning it over and over in her mind. Does the boy know the truth? Which truth? The lie she'd told Thorne, or the deeper, more dangerous truth she'd kept hidden even from Eli? The truth of who Calb's father really was? Braddock. The name felt like a snake in her mouth. He wasn't just a land developer. Men who just wanted land didn't ask questions like that. They didn't set fires in your soul with a simple, anonymous note. This was personal. Eli knew something was wrong. He saw it in the new tension in her shoulders, the way she kept looking over her shoulder, the way her hand would drift to the knife on her belt. He didn't press. He just kept his own rifle clean and close. The next morning, Marnie Bishop, the trading post owner, came to the forge. Her face was grim. "He's making offers," she said, without preamble. "Braddock. He's offered to buy out 3 families already, paying in gold. Says he's building a rail spur, but that doesn't explain why he's so interested in you two." "What kind of interested?" Eli asked, his hammer pausing over a glowing piece of iron. Marna hesitated. "He asked about the boy," she said, her eyes on Joanna. Joanna's breath hitched, a tiny, almost imperceptible sound. Marn heard it. "He said something strange," she continued, lowering her voice. "He asked if Calb's real father was still in the picture. Said he'd heard a rumor that a man named Thorne had passed through town a few weeks back." Joanna and Eli locked eyes across the forge. The air grew thick and heavy. "He's not guessing," Eli said, his voice a low growl. "He knows." "And he's using it," Joanna whispered, the crumpled note in her pocket suddenly feeling like a lead weight. That night, they didn't light the lamps. They sat in the dark cabin, the only light coming from the dying embers in the hearth. Calb, sensing the fear that had seeped into their small home, was quiet. He sat in a corner, arranging his stones into a protective wall around his feet. Just after midnight, they heard it. The soft crunch of boots on gravel, moving slowly past the cabin. Not a drunk stumbling home, not a friendly neighbor. This was the sound of someone trying not to be heard. Eli was on his feet in an instant, the rifle appearing in his hands as if by magic. He moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. Joanna knelt by Calb, her arms wrapped around him, her own heartbeat a frantic drum against his back. Then, a flicker of light from the direction of the forge, a small, hungry flicker that grew with terrifying speed. "Fire!" Eli snarled. He was through the door before the word was fully out of his mouth. Joanna was right behind him, shouting for Calb to stay inside. The forge wasn't fully engulfed yet. Oily black smoke was pouring from the open doorway, and a pile of oil-soaked kindling stacked against the main support beam was burning fiercely. It was a warning, a threat meant not to kill, but to terrify. To show them how easily everything they had built could be turned to ash. It worked. Eli beat at the flames with a heavy canvas tarp, choking on the acrid smoke. Joanna hauled buckets of water from the rain barrel, dousing the spreading fire. By the time it was out, the forge was a gutted, blackened ruin. Half of Eli's tools were melted or warped. The roof sagged dangerously. Their new beginning was a smoldering wreck. Marn and some of the other townsfolk came running. "I can send for the marshal," she offered, a pistol now strapped to her own hip. "But it won't do any good. Braddock has the law in his pocket." Eli didn't waste time on anger. He was already sifting through the wreckage, his face set in a grim mask, salvaging what he could. Joanna sat with Calb under the big ash tree, holding his small, trembling hands. He stared at the blackened shell of the forge, his eyes wide with a devastation that broke her heart. "Did I do something wrong, Mama?" he asked, his voice a tiny, wounded whisper. "No, baby," she choked out, pulling him into a fierce hug. "No, you didn't do a single thing wrong." That night, lying awake in the dark, Joanna knew she had to make a choice. She could run again. She could take Calb and disappear into the wilderness and spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder. Or she could fight. She remembered a line from one of Thorne's last letters, a line she knew by heart. "The world will always try to name you. You get to decide which names you answer to." She whispered it aloud to Calb. He listened, his head resting on her chest. Then he said, so quietly she almost didn't hear him, "I want to be Calb Garner." She blinked back tears. "You already are in all the ways that matter." "No," he said with a child's simple, profound clarity. "I want it to be real." He was choosing his own name. He was choosing his own father. When Eli returned from the trading post, his face grim but determined, he found them waiting. The townsfolk, it turned out, didn't like being terrorized. They had donated tools, lumber, and a new grindstone. They were angry. "He's buying up fear," Eli said, dropping a bundle of salvaged tools onto the cabin floor. "But fear doesn't build anything that lasts." "Then what does?" Joanna asked. Eli met her gaze, and a slow, fierce fire lit in his eyes. He nodded toward the charred skeleton of the forge. "We do," he said. "We rebuild it, bigger, stronger, and we let that bastard watch." For the next 3 days they worked. They worked with a furious, desperate energy, fueled by coffee and sheer stubborn will. Joanna, Eli, Marn, and a handful of other townspeople. They laid new brick, rehung the bellows, and raised a new roof. Calb was there every moment, fetching nails, handing up tools, a silent, serious foreman with an army of stones at his command. By the end of the week, the forge stood tall again, its new timbers raw and pale against the older, blackened stones. It wasn't just a workshop anymore. It was a monument to their defiance. On the 4th day, Braddock came back. He walked into the yard alone, a condescending smile on his handsome face. Joanna was at the anvil, the rhythmic clang of her hammer a defiant heartbeat. She didn't stop. Eli emerged from the forge, a rag in one hand, his rifle in the other. "I underestimated you people," Braddock said, his voice smooth as silk. "I didn't think a little fire would unite a town of nobodies." Joanna brought the hammer down with a force that sent sparks flying, the sound cracking through the air like a gunshot. Braddock flinched. "You think you've won?" he sneered. "This town will forget you by winter." "Let them," Joanna said, her voice low and steady. "We're not staying because of them." Braddock's eyes narrowed. "Then why are you staying?" Eli took a step forward, his presence a solid wall of intimidation. "Because men like you," he said, his voice a dangerous rumble, "always expect people like us to run." Braddock's smile vanished. For a long moment, he just stared at them, at the rebuilt forge, at the quiet determination in their eyes. Then a cold, thin smile returned to his lips. "We'll see," he said, turning on his heel. "We'll just see how long your luck holds." He walked away, but they all knew it wasn't over.
That night they sat around a bonfire behind the new forge, Joanna, Eli, Calb, and Marn. They shared a simple meal, a quiet celebration of their victory. Calb laid out his stones, but this time he didn't build a wall. He built a tiny house, a tiny forge, and a tiny family. Joanna leaned against Eli, watching her son. "Did you ever think we'd get this far?" she whispered. Eli shook his head. "No," he admitted, "but I always hoped." She smiled, a real smile, free from the weight of the past. But across the creek, hidden in the deep shadows of the trees, a match flared. A pair of eyes watched the happy scene, cold and patient. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of a new storm, and this time, it was coming for the truth. The morning after their defiant celebration, a new kind of silence settled over Tabor's Creek. It was the heavy, watchful quiet that comes before a lightning strike. In the cabin, Joanna held the key to it all. Calb's real birth record, the one Micah had given her. The father's name wasn't blank. It was there, clear as day. Levi read. The truth was a loaded gun, and she didn't know who to aim it at. Telling Calb would shatter the fragile peace he'd found. Telling Eli felt like a betrayal of the trust he'd placed in her, a trust built on the lie that Calb was Thorne's son. And what would Braddock do if he found out? Her turmoil was interrupted by the arrival of a rider, his horse lathered, his eyes wide with urgency. He carried a letter with an official-looking seal from Junction Ridge, a day's ride away. He handed it to Joanna and was gone before she could ask a single question. She unfolded it, her hands trembling. It was from a lawyer, a man named Hollis Granger. He wrote that her name, Joanna read, had appeared in the last will and testament of a recently deceased cattle baron named Orson Crowley. Crowley? She murmured. The name was a faint echo from her childhood, a man her mother had mentioned once. The will says he owed you a debt, Eli said, reading over her shoulder. The letter summoned her to Junction Ridge to claim her inheritance. It mentioned her by her maiden name. It made no mention of Calb. It's a trap, Eli said, his jaw tight. Maybe, she replied. But if Braddock is using my family's past against me, I need to know what other secrets are buried out there. She decided to go, leaving Calb in the care of Eli and Marn. In Junction Ridge, the lawyer, a fussy man with round glasses, laid it all out. Orson Crowley years ago had been in a train wreck. He would have died, washed away in a flooded river, if a young woman hadn't pulled him from the wreckage. That woman was Joanna's mother. Crowley had promised to repay her one day, and he had. Granger unrolled a map and a deed. He tapped a plot of land circled in red ink. Joanna's heart stopped. It was the land they were on, the land the forge was built on, the land with the cabin, the creek, the ash tree, all of it. Crowley had owned it all along, and he had left it to her, legally, irrevocably. She rode back to Tabor's Creek, the deed clutched in her hand like a shield. She finally had something that couldn't be taken from her. She had a home. But when she arrived, she found a stranger waiting under the ash tree. A boy, no older than 17, with a haunted look in his eyes and a rifle slung awkwardly over his shoulder. He looked like a stray, but there was a familiarity to him, a ghost of someone she once knew. He held out a letter. I was told to bring this to you, he said, his voice cracking, from a man who couldn't come himself. She recognized the handwriting instantly. It was Thorne's. He had written it after he left her, on his way south. He'd run into this boy on the road, a runaway with no name and no future. Thorne had seen a reflection of himself in the boy's desperate eyes. He'd taken him under his wing, given him a new name, Ash, and sent him north with a final message for Joanna. You never owed me anything, but I owed you peace. I hope I finally found a way to give you that. Joanna looked from the letter to the deed, and then it clicked. The lawyer had mentioned a witness to the will, a man who had made sure the deed was filed correctly just weeks before Crowley's death. A man named Thorne. He hadn't just left her with a memory. He had secured her future. He had given her a home, and now he had sent her a son. That night, as the two boys slept peacefully by the fire, a new kind of family settled around her. But their peace was short-lived. The next day, Braddock returned. And this time, he wasn't alone. He came with the regional marshal and a deed of his own, claiming he had purchased the land from Crowley's estate. He gave them 2 days to vacate. It was a lie, but a lie backed by a badge. Joanna, however, was no longer the frightened woman who had rolled into Rustwood on a broken wheel. She and Marn rode hard for Fort Benedict, the territorial capital. They didn't just find a lawyer, they found proof. Braddock's deed was a forgery. Crowley's real will had been filed weeks earlier, with an ironclad signature from a witness named Thorne. When they returned, Braddock was waiting, this time with a half-dozen armed riders, ready to take the land by force. Joanna stood on her porch, her deed in her hand, Eli by her side. "It's over, Braddock," she said, her voice clear and strong. "You lost." He just laughed and dismounted, his hand on his gun. But before he could take a step, another figure moved out of the shadows of the forge. It was Ash. He leveled the rifle Thorne had given him, his hand surprisingly steady. "Try it," the boy said, his voice low and dangerous. Braddock froze. He saw Eli, his rifle at the ready. He saw Marna and a dozen other townspeople emerging from the trees, all armed, their faces hard and determined. He had thought he was fighting one broken woman. He had discovered he was fighting a town. He was fighting a family. He turned without another word, climbed onto his horse, and rode away. And this time, he didn't look back. Months turned into a year. The forge burned bright, its steady rhythm the new heartbeat of Tabor's Creek. Ash grew into his new name, the haunted look in his eyes replaced by a quiet confidence. And Calb, secure in the love of the only father he had ever wanted, learned to shape hot iron into things of beauty and strength. One autumn afternoon, beneath the branches of the old ash tree, Joanna married Eli. She didn't take his name. She didn't need to. She had finally found her own. Tacked to the wall of their cabin, right over the hearth, hung the deed to their land, a constant reminder of the ghost who had given them peace. And tucked away in a small wooden box, Joanna kept 2 birth records, one with a lie that had saved a good man's heart, and one with a truth that had forged a family. She knew that one day she would show them to Calb, but not yet. For now, they were just a family, scarred and stitched together, building a life on land that was finally, truly, their own. They had faced down their ghosts and discovered that home isn't a place you find. It's a place you build, a place you defend, a place you make true, one defiant heartbeat at a time. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss the next time we venture into the shadows.